Imagine the most important philosopher in Western history, the person who launched 2,400 years of intellectual tradition, never wrote a single word. Now, everything we think we know about Socrates comes from other people's accounts, and those accounts wildly contradict each other. In one version, he's a practical advice giver, a kind of ancient self-help guru. In another, he's something almost inhuman, a demonic figure driven by a superhuman love of knowledge. The real Socrates lies somewhere between these two portraits, and we may never find him. This is the puzzle at the heart of Plato's dialogues. Understanding how Plato constructed those dialogues changes how we read them, how we think about philosophy, and how we understand the entire Western intellectual tradition. To understand why Plato wrote what he wrote and how he wrote it, we need to understand the world he inherited, a world where old certainties had been shattered, a new class of intellectual mercenaries exploited the ruins, and one man's relentless questioning offered the only path forward. Socrates is the origin point of Western philosophical speculation, and also its most enigmatic figure. He left no writings. We depend entirely on intermediaries. And the two most important give us radically different portraits. Xenophon knew Socrates personally and wrote the memorabilia, but Xenophon was a pedestrian thinker. He couldn't grasp the depths of what he witnessed. His Socrates is a generic wise man, intelligent, practical, dispensing useful advice for improving young people, but indistinguishable from any other sage. The heroic philosophical depth is entirely absent. Plato gives us something different. He was both a gifted dramatist and a profound philosopher. He could follow the most difficult strands of Socratic thought and render them in beautiful literary form. His Socrates is demonic, transcending ordinary human life, driven by a love and passion for knowledge that exceeds human possibility. Plato takes the raw material of Socratic conversation and elevates it the way a Greek sculptor transforms marble into something more than stone. In Xenophon, merely a wise man. In Plato, more than a man. The historical Socrates lies somewhere between, and locating him remains one of the great unsolved problems of ancient philosophy. This isn't just an academic curiosity, which Socrates, we believe in, shapes how we read every dialogue, how we assess every argument, and what we take philosophy itself to be. The gap between these portraits is the space in which all interpretation of Plato takes place. But before we can go further with either Socrates or Plato, we need to understand the intellectual currents that shaped their world. Three major forces defined post-Periclean Athens. Each played a direct role in the crisis that philosophy arose to address. The first was the Pythagorean mathematical tradition. The second was the devastating new physics from Ionia. The third was the rise of the Sophists. Together, they created a landscape that made Socratic philosophy both necessary and urgent. Greek mathematics had been advancing rapidly in the century before Socrates. But in Pythagoras' hands, mathematics intertwined with numerology and number mysticism. It hadn't yet separated from mystical thinking. Mathematics was a quasi-religious enterprise. Pythagoras led a monastic mathematical community governed by strict religious rules. He believed in reincarnation. His central insight was this: mathematical objects are eternal. Mathematics constitutes the inner structure, the marrow of things experienced through the senses. What we perceive through sight and hearing and the touch is limited, shaped, and formed by mathematical principles operating beneath the surface of experience. Our senses show us the appearance, mathematics reveals the reality. Socrates absorbed this tradition deeply. He was drawn to the Pythagorean project of creating a cosmos, from the Greek for an orderly, intelligible universe, out of the chaos of sense perception. The conviction that behind the flux of appearances lies a stable, knowable structure became foundational for everything Socratic and Platonic. But the second intellectual force of post-Periclean Athens pulled in exactly the opposite direction, and its consequences for moral and political life were devastating. Socrates also defined himself against certain predecessors, chiefly the pre-Socratic physicists of Ionia, the islands between Greece and Asia Minor. Thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes produced, for the first time in the Western tradition, a materialistic, rational, and non-teleological accounts of nature. Non-teleological means without purpose or design. They explained natural phenomena without myth and without inherent meaning. Nature was a blind, irrational collection of material objects in flux. The sun was no longer Apollo's golden chariot driven by a god across the sky. It became a hot rock. This seems like a harmless scientific correction. It was anything but. Before rational physics, human understanding of nature and moral obligation had been unified within a mythological framework. When you swore an oath by the sun, you invoked a deity. The oath had weight because a god enforced it. If the sun is just a hot rock, those oaths become mere sounds. And when this materialistic mindset was transferred from nature to the social world, it produced corrosive skepticism, undermining belief in right and wrong, rendering people selfish and untrustworthy, atomizing individuals, dissolving the bonds of family and city. The Ionian physicists, by demystifying nature, inadvertently shattered the moral framework that held Greek civilization together. Physics generated a centrifugal force in social relations, driving people apart. Socrates regarded the Sophists as the intellectual heirs of the Ionian physicists. When a materialistic approach was applied to laws and politics, the result was sophistry, the deliberate manipulation of words. If no natural moral order existed, the Sophists were the shrewd operators who recognized the vacuum and exploited it. They developed a new technē, a Greek term meaning art or craft, a systematic skill that can be explained and taught. This is the root of our word technical. The Sophists' particular technē was rhetoric, the art of persuasion regardless of truth. They were itinerant teachers traveling the Mediterranean, charging fees to teach men cleverness in speaking, how to seize political power, how to persuade juries. Their core teaching was stark. Politics is about power, not knowledge. The Sophists were not fools. They were brilliant, dangerous, and they possessed a coherent worldview. That's precisely what made them formidable opponents. They had looked at the wreckage left by Ionian physics and drawn a logical conclusion. If there is no moral order built into nature, then the only thing that matters is the ability to persuade. These were the ideas in the air, but Plato had personal reasons too, and they burned. Plato inherited the problems Socrates grappled with, but he brought his own concerns, animated by what can only be described as a cold rage toward Athens. Two catastrophes shaped everything he wrote, and the first, the execution of Socrates in 399 BCE. Athens killed the justest man in the city, the truly superior man. For Plato, this was the greatest of evils, a democracy murdering the one person who least deserved to die. The man who spent his entire life trying to make his fellow citizens wiser and more virtuous was put to death by those very citizens. The second catastrophe, the Peloponnesian War. As Thucydides recounts, Alcibiades, brilliant, reckless, treacherous, persuaded Athens to launch the Sicilian expedition at a moment of supreme overconfidence. The result was catastrophic. The navy and army were devastated. Athens lost its empire, its wealth, its manpower, its political power, and finally its autonomy. A thriving city destroyed itself through collective foolishness. For Plato, these two disasters were inseparable. The same democratic system that cheered Alcibiades' disastrous Sicilian adventure later condemned Socrates to death. Democracy meant rule by the mob, rule by those who applaud loudest, where popular acclaim rather than wisdom determines who leads. This was an abstract political theory for Plato. It was lived experience. Right? He watched his city destroy its own power through collective foolishness, and then he watched it murder the one man who had tried to make it wise. Plato maintained a persistent, lifelong hostility toward democratic government. Every dialogue he wrote carries this conviction beneath the surface. So that's the crisis and the man. An intellectual world torn apart by materialistic physics, a moral vacuum exploited by sophistic rhetoricians, a city that destroyed itself through hubris and then killed its best citizen, and a philosopher consumed by grief and cold rage who decided to do something about it. Now let's look at what Plato actually built in response, now the dialogues themselves. Plato is one of the few ancient writers whose entire corpus survives, a testament to his enormous influence. Every dialogue attributed to him by any ancient source has come down to us. The corpus comprises 35 dialogues, though a few shorter ones are considered spurious, likely produced by students or manuscript dealers in the Hellenistic scroll trade. The dialogues divide into three broad periods. The early dialogues are called aporetic, from the Greek aporia, meaning impasse. These dialogues ask questions. What is courage? What is friendship? What is knowledge? But don't arrive at definitive answers. This is not a failure. The impasse is the point. It stimulates further thinking. Plato's dialogues are not dogma. They represent a way of life, a mimesis, a representation of intellectual activity the reader is meant to emulate. The aim is not to deposit prepackaged ideas, but to provoke independent thought. Examples include the Crito, the Apology, and the Ion. Socrates discusses issues, makes characteristically ironic points, and the reader becomes acquainted with the Socratic method of question and answer. These are Plato finding his footing as a philosophical writer. The Gorgias, Protagoras, and Meno mark the transition to the middle period. Here, Plato mounts a direct, sustained attack on sophistry. Gorgias and Protagoras were great sophists, itinerant teachers of rhetoric who traveled the Mediterranean, charging fees to teach men cleverness in speaking, how to seize political power, how to persuade juries and assemblies. Their core teaching, politics, is about power, not knowledge. These attacking dialogues are also remarkably funny. In Plato, playfulness and seriousness are not opposed. Socrates constantly jokes. Verbal irony, conceptual irony, dramatic irony, layered upon irony, yet the humor operates in service of the deepest moral seriousness. The Protagoras is full of witty lines and comic reversals, but its moral purpose is inescapable. Solemnity is not a prerequisite for philosophical depth. The middle period is Plato at the height of his powers. The Republic stands at the center, arguably the greatest single work of Western philosophy. It addresses the full range of human experience, politics, ethics, epistemology, ontology, logic, and the theory of art. All converge on the central question of moral order, the foundational point around which every other inquiry revolves, branching from the Republic, the Symposium, exploring eros, love and desire, and the Phaedo on death. Together, they probe the fundamental emotional and philosophical problems of existence. Both rank among the most beautiful literary constructions of antiquity. And this points to something crucial. Plato is a poet as well as a philosopher. Socrates was a sage who never wrote. Plato was from the outset a literary artist. This means attending simultaneously to the dramatic and symbolic elements and to the logical arguments. The mythological and the poetic dimensions are not decorative. There is not a word out of place in the Platonic dialogue. Even framing scenes at the beginnings of dialogues convey information essential to the philosophy. There are no arbitrary elements. There are no accidents. The middle period closes with transitional works, the Theaetetus, an aporetic dialogue where three attempts to define knowledge all fail, and the Parmenides. Even inconclusive dialogues educate. Socrates enlarges the domain of recognized ignorance. This process is propedeutic, meaning preparatory, reading students for deeper learning, and protractic, meaning exhortatory, urging them toward philosophy. The precondition for learning is an open mind, uncorrupted by the presumption of already having all the answers. In the late dialogue, Socrates diminishes as a character. In the Laws, Plato's final dialogue, the principal speaker is an unnamed Athenian stranger. Plato may speak more directly in his own voice here. The dramatic richness declines, strict logical analysis dominates. The Laws shows marks of an unfinished draft. Aristotle was a member of the Academy during this period and may have influenced the increasingly analytical character of the late writing. It's not just what Plato wrote, it's how he wrote it. The dialogue form itself is a philosophical innovation. Every great philosopher must discover not only original content, but an original form of expression. Plato chose the philosophical dialogue, and no subsequent writer has matched it. Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion succeeds as philosophy but falls short as literary art. Spinoza chose the strict geometric method. Wittgenstein chose numbered propositions in the Tractatus. Plato, the greatest poet-philosopher before Nietzsche, fused rigorous dialectical inquiry with dramatic technique, the culmination of both Greek literary tradition and Greek philosophical inquiry. He didn't arrive at this form by accident. As a young man, Plato aspired to be a tragic poet. He wrote tragedies and prepared to enter them in the annual Athenian competition, the religious festival where playwrights competed for the prize of best set of 3 tragedies and a satyr play. Then Plato encountered Socrates in the agora. According to tradition, Socrates discussed Plato's tragedies and subjected poetry itself to critical examination. The poets, the tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and above all the epic poet Homer, served as the primary educators of Greece. Their influence was enormous. If the people lacked moral knowledge, the poets responsible for their education had failed, transmitting moral ignorance rather than wisdom. When Socrates demonstrated the inadequacy of Plato's own tragedies, Plato went home and burned them. He never entered the competition. This testifies to the extraordinary force of Socratic rhetoric over gifted young minds, but Plato didn't abandon literary art. Instead, he invented an entirely new form, merging philosophy and poetry into something unprecedented: the philosophical dialogue. The man who could have been Athens' next great playwright became something far more consequential. Because the dialogues are dramas, reading them demands a skill most philosophy students are never taught. Every action, gesture, and statement carries significance. Nothing occurs by accident. Consider Republic Book 1. Socrates defeats Thrasymachus using arguments that, on close inspection, are weak and unconvincing. This is not a lapse. Socrates deploys deliberately inadequate arguments as a strategic device. He needs to draw Glaucon and Adeimantus, younger, more promising interlocutors, into the discussion. By appearing unable to mount a strong defense of justice against Thrasymachus' challenge, he provokes them to take up the argument themselves, deepening the inquiry far beyond where Thrasymachus could have taken it. When Socrates produces a bad argument, the reader must always ask, why? The answer is never that Plato made a mistake. Here's another example. When Cephalus concludes his conversation with Socrates at the beginning of the Republic and withdraws to perform religious sacrifices, that departure is not incidental. It reveals something essential about his character. A man who prefers the comfort of conventional piety to the discomfort of philosophical examination. The dialogues operate on 2 simultaneous levels, logical and dramatic. On the logical level, arguments must be analyzed for philosophical validity, definitions tested, conclusions assessed. On the dramatic level, characters' actions, motivations, and responses must be interpreted for what they reveal about the human soul. These two levels interact constantly. A character's inability to follow an argument tells us something about the argument and about the character. An unexpected exit from a conversation tells us about the person leaving and about the limits of philosophy's reach. Reading Plato means reading both levels at once. Irony pervades Socrates' speech. His characteristic stance of apparent ignorance and faint curiosity is not a weakness. It's one of the dialogue form's greatest strengths. It serves three distinct functions. The first is provocation. When a clever interlocutor recognizes that Socrates is playing a role, pretending not to know, the natural response is competitive. The interlocutor tries to give a definitive answer to meet the challenge to pin Socrates down. This opens the door to genuine dialectical examination. The interlocutor commits to a position, and Socrates can now test it rigorously, exposing the true extent of what was thought to be knowledge but turns out to be ignorance. Irony as provocation is a trap, but a generous one. Right? It doesn't destroy the interlocutor. It reveals to them how much more thinking remains to be done. The second function is deception, and it signals failure. When a dialogue ends on an ironic note, it means the interlocutor has been unable or unwilling to engage in genuine inquiry. In the Meno, Socrates concludes by telling Meno that virtue must come from the gods, a transparently ironic dismissal marking the collapse of their joint investigation. Meno couldn't do the work, so Socrates gives him a pretty falsehood and moves on. The third function is invitation. An invitation to re-examine what you think you already know. This is what makes Socrates perennially relevant. Unlike Gorgias, who boasts that no one has posed him a new question in years, Socrates embodies the principle that inquiry is inexhaustible. Every day brings fresh questions. Even yesterday's unresolved questions are renewed each morning. Irony keeps the door open. It refuses to let any answer become final. Each dialogue is also a self-contained work of art. The Phaedrus is a small, flawless masterpiece. The Symposium rewards sustained rereading across a lifetime. But beyond each dialogue's internal content, the external architecture matters. How many sections, what shape the argument takes, how parts relate to the whole. Individual dialogues are not isolated. They fit into a larger intellectual structure with definite connections and orderings. One practical note: scholars cite Plato using Stephanus numbers from the 1578 edition by Henri Estienne, whose Latin name was Stephanus, the first to present Greek text alongside Latin translation. Citations specify page, paragraph, and line with extraordinary precision, comparable only to chapter and verse citation of the Bible. That comparison is apt. After the Bible, Plato's collected dialogues arguably constitute the most significant single text in the Western intellectual tradition. The philosophical problems first articulated here, the mind-body problem, reason versus emotion, philosophy versus poetry, are not isolated topics but interwoven dimensions of a single inquiry. The method driving that inquiry has a name, the Socratic elenchus, the Greek term for Socrates' mode of cross-examination. It proceeds by asking questions and testing answers in rigorous, step-by-step fashion. It is dialectical. Disciplined conversation between two people genuinely committed to discovering truth, not merely winning arguments. Platonic dialectic rests on the sincere conviction that truth is attainable through honest, collaborative exchange. Step back now. What does all of this add up to? One of the most important structural features of the dialogues is the absence of soliloquy. No character in the Platonic corpus ever reasons in isolation. Philosophical inquiry always requires a partner. Even Socrates has his daimon, a divine sign, an inner voice that speaks to him, though it only warns him away from certain actions and never directs him positively. But the daimon is not a substitute for human conversation. Socrates never leaves the city. He doesn't retreat to a mountaintop to think alone. His constant daily conversation with fellow citizens reflects a deep philosophical commitment. Truth can be reached only through living exchange between persons. This isn't a biographical quirk, it's a foundational philosophical principle. Knowledge is not something one mind achieves in solitary contemplation. It emerges through the friction and collaboration of genuine dialogue, two people testing each other's ideas with honesty and rigor, each willing to abandon a cherished position when reason demands it. The dialogues embody this principle in their very form. Philosophy is conversation. It has always been conversation. The dialogues offer a meta-education. Rather than transmitting fixed knowledge, they teach the practice of self-directed inquiry. Plato teaches the reader how to read, how to attend to multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. Socrates teaches how to speak, and more importantly, how to listen. The most effective interlocutors in the dialogues are not the most voluble, but those who speak sparingly and listen attentively, responding only when genuinely drawn out by Socratic questioning. This educative function aligns with Plato's own aesthetic theory in the Republic. All art and poetry must be judged by a moral standard, and Plato intends his dialogues to meet that standard. And they educate in virtue, either by imaging a good person acting well, offering the reader a model to emulate, or by goading the reader to ask fundamental questions they never thought to ask. There is no body of Socratic dogma to extract from the dialogues. What they teach is a way of approaching life, a method of interrogating oneself and others. The precondition for learning is an open mind uncorrupted by the presumption of already having all the answers. Pull the threads together. Socrates responded to the moral crisis created by Ionian physics and the Sophists by grounding inquiry in honest dialogue. Patient, rigorous, collaborative conversation aimed at truth. Plato, driven by grief over Socrates' death and rage at Athens' folly, preserved that method by inventing a literary form that fuses philosophy and poetry into something no one had seen before and no one has matched since. The dialogues are not a body of doctrine. Right? They are a sustained demonstration of how to think, how to question, how to listen, how to recognize the limits of one's own knowledge, how to call things by their right names. The result is a corpus that has been copied, studied, and debated for 2,400 years, second only to the Bible in its influence on Western thought. The dialogues remain relevant because their central invitation never expires. Examine what you think you know, remain open, engage in genuine conversation. The philosophical problems Plato identified, justice, knowledge, love, death, the good life, have not been solved. They are renewed with each generation. That's the domain of the dialogues, not a museum of ancient opinions, but a living practice of inquiry. Picture Socrates in the agora talking to anyone who will listen every single day. A shoemaker, a general, a visiting sophist, a slave, it doesn't matter. The conversation is what matters, and the conviction behind it that today's questions matter and that yesterday's unresolved questions are renewed each morning. Plato captured that practice in literary form so it could survive his teacher's death and Athens' determination to silence it. He created works that demand from their readers the same qualities Socrates demanded from his interlocutors: honesty, patience, humility, and the willingness to discover that everything you thought you knew was wrong. 2,400 years later, the invitation stands. The dialogues don't tell you what to think, they show you how to begin thinking, and they demonstrate in every line and dramatic gesture that this willingness to question is the most important intellectual act a human being can perform. That is the domain of the dialogues, a sustained and loving struggle to achieve clarity about the most fundamental questions of existence,